verses 12 through 15. Let us listen for the word of God. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. For 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, or your male or female slave, or your ox or your donkey, or any of your livestock, or the resident alien in your towns, so that your male and female slave may rest as well as you. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. And we hear from the Gospel according to Matthew, from chapter 11, verses 28 through 30. It is a familiar passage. Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart. You will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. A water park might seem like a strange place to celebrate and honor Sabbath, but that's just what I did a few weeks ago. For the past 3 weeks, I've been in Colorado, spending time with family, enjoying the much cooler weather there. I got to spend time with my parents, my brother and his family, extended family, and it was restorative. But there was one portion of our trip that was particularly restful. It was our time at Great Wolf Lodge. If you've heard of it, you know this is a themed indoor water park. It's very much geared toward kids, but like Disneyland or any other park, kids of all ages can have fun there, and we certainly did. JT's family joined us for this part of the trip. My in-laws came from Round Rock, my other in-laws came from Seattle. We all sort of converged in Colorado Springs. And so we had a ratio of 6 adults with 4 kids. Very nice ratio, let me tell you. We found ourselves taking turns keeping an eye on the kids as they splashed in the kiddie pool or braved the big wave pool. And this meant that at any given time, at least 2 of us adults could just relax and rest, or go on the big water slides, which we certainly did. It was very nice to have this chance to relax, but even having the responsibility of watching our youngest family member wasn't so bad. Our niece, at 15 months old, still takes 2 naps a day, which meant someone had the very strenuous task of sitting with her while she slept by the pool. I more than happily signed up for this role one of the days that we were there. She got to snooze in her car seat right there by the pool, and I just got to hang out in a lounge chair and watch her slumber. I listened to the gleeful shouts of kids playing in the water, giving thanks that my 2 and our nephew were safely under the watch of grandparents. And while watching a sleeping baby is enough to transport us into a time of stillness, as I sat there, I couldn't help but think of all of the times in the past few years when I held my own sleeping babies, holding them in one arm and holding my cell phone in the other, scrolling through Facebook or texting friends, doing what I could to stay connected to the outside world, reminding myself that there were other things going on other than diaper changes and feeding getting little ones to sleep. Those were very distracted moments for me. Not bad necessarily, but distracted. I wasn't able to really be present in that moment with that phone in my hand. But there at the water park, those couple of weeks ago, as I watched my niece sleep, I had no phone in my hand. It wasn't practical. At the water park, there was too much of a risk of getting it water damaged, so my phone stayed safely tucked in my bag. Now, even though in some sense the entire 3 weeks that I was there was a Sabbath, a rest from work, it was in that precious hour, watching her sleep, that I remembered the act of disconnecting for Sabbath. I sat there and I marveled at how my niece is gloriously created in the image of God. Even in that noisy indoor water park, I was acutely aware that God was there. It was a profound experience of Sabbath. As I mentioned before, today marks the first of 3 sermons on the topic of Sabbath, appropriate for this time of year as summer is wrapping up. We're all sort of gearing up to get back into the school year. Next week, we're going to look at the particulars of what Sabbath is. But for today, we're going to look at what it means for Sabbath as a commandment. Our Deuteronomy text points out the 4th commandment, as told to Moses and passed along to the Israelites. While the other commandments, some are very short, given only a few words like, "Thou shalt not steal," this 4th commandment has a lengthy description. And in that description, there is a reminder of the time in Egypt. The original recipients of these commandments, the Israelites, were only recently released from slavery. Pharaoh finally relented and then was thwarted by the Red Sea, and so the people were free at last. It seems they needed a reminder of this new reality. After 400 years, generation upon generation, bound by slavery, it was going to take some getting used to being free, unbound by the chains of oppression. And so in this commandment, God declares a Sabbath day, one day of the week, set apart to be holy, set apart to be a day of rest and stillness. For a people who were so used to working every waking hour, they didn't just need an invitation to rest. They needed a commandment to rest. They needed to be directed in this way so as to give themselves permission to rest and be still. They had to take a break from the demands of work so that they could just be in the presence of God. God must have known that the Israelites would probably just go back to their old ways, falling into that rhythm of slavery, this time not enslaved to Pharaoh, but to themselves. Falling into that trap of working non-stop. They would do more of the same and lead to exhaustion, because that's all they've ever known. So God gives them this commandment to take a break. And the people take it seriously. There were very specific regulations on how to do Sabbath. No work was to be done, not even the smallest of tasks. It was a day to be spent in prayer and devotion, and the understanding of Sabbath was very narrow. But Jesus, when he comes along, broadens that understanding. In our passage from Matthew, we see Jesus offering thanks to God. He's praying for his disciples, for the people who have faithfully been following him. And toward the end of this prayer, he lifts up these familiar words. They're pretty well known. They would make a lovely needlepoint to hang on the wall or put on a pillow, because they say, "Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest." Now, I suppose any one of us could read ourselves into this passage. Who among us isn't weary at times or carrying heavy burdens? But we need to remember the context in which these words were spoken. Most people in first century Palestine were victims of deep oppression. They were people who suffered tremendously. They were at the mercy of the Roman Empire. There's nothing nice or pretty about living in these times. And if we want to think about a modern day equivalent, we need only think of the asylum seekers at our border. Those refugees who are fleeing from unspeakable horrors in their home countries, willing to cross dangerous lands to get to refuge. That's the level of suffering and pain that we're talking about here. That's the kind of folks Jesus was talking to. And so Jesus offers these words of comfort and a promise of rest to a people who desperately needed it. He goes on to talk about how his yoke is easy and his burden is light. But followers of Jesus know that he wasn't saying life would be a cakewalk now that they were following him. He wasn't saying that there would be no more struggles or suffering. What he's talking about with that yoke is obedience and service. He's talking about those acts that we as people of faith carry out to practice our faith, namely those acts laid out in the commandments. So when he says that his yoke is easy, he's saying that the law doesn't need to be so binding anymore. The religious folks had gotten it into their heads that there was this very particular way to follow the law. It was very straightforward. You're right or you're wrong. You're in or you're out. And here we see Jesus leaning into the nuance. He's broadening the interpretation. He's opening up our understanding of what the law means by saying his yoke is easy, his burden is light. And in the passages that follow this, we see him living that out. Just after this passage we read, we see Jesus and his disciples plucking grain out of a field, a major no-no on the Sabbath. And just after that, the religious officials try to trap Jesus by tempting him to heal a man on the Sabbath, another major no-no. Well, he responds to them by saying, "It is lawful to do good on the Sabbath day," thereby busting open the definition of what it means to follow the law. According to Jesus, it's no longer about following these tightly bound rules if these rules are not being interpreted through the lens of love. It was an act of love to make sure his disciples were fed on the Sabbath. It was an act of love to heal that man on the Sabbath. Jesus doesn't deny the importance of Sabbath. It's not like he writes it off and dismisses it, but he declares that there's no point in practicing Sabbath if we're not practicing love. If we're so tightly bound by these rules that we're missing opportunities to love our neighbor, well, we're missing the point. Sabbath brings that point back into focus. Sabbath is the gift God gives us to rest and find peace, to stop just going through the motions of our week and to reflect on what really matters. Sabbath is like an existential pause button that refocuses our attention. In her writings, the late Toni Morrison had a way of refocusing our attention. Her work is a gift to us. It reminds us to pay attention to narratives that might not be widely heard, pay attention to where love is at work in the world. We're going to watch a brief clip of her in an interview where she talks about love as a metaphor. Bonnie, if you'll cue that up for us.
Morrison writes about places where even love found its way with an ice pick. Maybe that's the same. Can we talk about love when you say love is a metaphor? And when I go back through novels, love is there in so many different ways and forms. Particularly when I look at the women in the novels, at the extraordinary things they do for love. There's the grandmother who has her leg amputated so that she can have an insurance policy that will buy a house and take care of her children as they grow up. Seti who is willing to kill her children before the slave catchers can come and seize them. What kind of love is that?
Some of it's very fierce, powerful, distorted, even because the duress they work under is so overwhelming. But I think they believed, as I do, it may be true that, people say, I didn't ask to be born back in the day. And that's what we're here. We are here, and we have to do something nurturing that we respect before we go. We must. It is more interesting, more complicated, more intellectually demanding, and more morally demanding to love somebody, to take care of somebody, to make one other person feel good. Now the dangers of that are the dangers of setting oneself up as a martyr or as, the one without whom it will not be done.
Paul of East says to Seti, your love is too thick.
It's too thick.
Is that what you're telling me about?
It can get to be very excessive.
How do we know when love is too thick?
We don't. We really don't. That's a big problem. We don't know when to stop, as Baby Suck says. When is it too much and when is it not enough? That is the problem of the human mind and the soul. But we have to try that. We have to try that. We have to do that. And not doing it is so poor for the self. It's so poor for the mind. It's so uninteresting to live without that. And it has no risk. There's no risk involved. And that just seems to make life not just livable, but a gallant event.
Toni Morrison sure had a way of articulating what matters, bringing our attention to the need for love and nurture. A fierce sort of love, as she said. A whole lot of powerful and risky sort of love. And she talks about sacrificial love, which sounds a whole lot like what Jesus preaches and practices. Now there's an interesting variation between the two descriptions on the commandment for Sabbath. In Exodus chapter 20, we see one version where we are told that we need to rest because God rested on that seventh day. It points back to that Genesis and creation story. There's very much a vertical dimension there. It's about a relationship between us and God. But our passage in Deuteronomy is a little different. That piece isn't mentioned. Instead, there's that reminder that those people were once slaves in Egypt, reminding the Israelites that we are created for wholeness and freedom. This commandment, this version of it, is more horizontal in nature. There's this relational aspect to it. So perhaps Sabbath isn't so much about doing nothing for the whole day, or following a very specific set of rules. Perhaps Sabbath is more of an invitation to pause, to stop going through the motions so we can pay attention. Pay attention to what God is up to in the world. Pay attention to what God is calling us to do. And pay attention to love and where love is needed in our world. Amen. Our hymn of reflection is O Day of Rest